there we go. All right, so we've got our live stream set up. So it is 9:05. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Ms. Ada Ramirez for providing Spanish translation for today's session. Please be sure to click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select English or Spanish. Welcome to the second workshop in our Ministry Fair series, Servants of the Spirit, Gifts for Ministry. Today's topic is Church Finance and Housing Allowances, presented by the Reverend Michele Racusin, CFO of the Diocese of Los Angeles. This session is being live streamed on the Diocesan Facebook page and YouTube channel, and the recording will remain available for viewing on demand. A link to that video, along with the resources presented, will also be available on the convention website. At this time, I ask everyone to mute yourselves. Anytime you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will answer them following the presentation. Following today's session, feel free to send any follow-up questions you may have to me at swiley@ladiocese.org or directly to Reverend Michele, pardon me, at Michele Racusin at ladiocese.org. And with that, I turn it over to you.
So let us open in with a quick prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for technology that allows us to share our thoughts and ideas and our vision. We give you thanks for all the gifts that you have showered us with. We ask that you help us to be good stewards of everything that you have given. And this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So good morning and welcome. It's my pleasure to be here. I am going to figure out how to do this screen share. And to start the slideshow. Did it come up? Oh, wrong one. There we go. So this is part of a nuts and bolts series. And today on basic church finances. I can hear.
I can hear Reverend Michele. Are you not able to hear her, Ada?
Okay.
Yeah. No, I can hear Reverend Michele and you just fine. Okay. Okay, let's try again. Are you ready, Ada? Okay. I can hear you, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Michele, did you select English at the bottom?
I did.
Okay, I'm not sure what the problem would be then.
Let me get out of screen share because I can't see. Okay, let me get out of screen share.
Okay.
And see if I can redo this. Okay, let me make sure that it's recorded on. It says English. Yes, I'm in English.
Okay. Ada, can you hear her? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear Michele? Yeah.
Well, worst case, we could all go to the English and then we'll just have you translate after I say something. I know it's not as efficient. Mhm.
Has she checked her microphone settings?
That is a good question. Ada, can you hear me?
Maybe we can type it in the chat notes.
Yeah, I'll message her. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Oh, good.
No
Okay.
worries. No worries.
Okay. So are we ready?
I think we're good to go.
Okay, good. So this presentation is on housing allowances, and the housing allowance is a tremendous tax benefit to clergy. And that's why it's so important to really understand it, because it has to be done correctly. It is not hard, but we have to be mindful of a few key points. And so that's the purpose of this. And if you have questions, type them in chat and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So in order to make this whole concept of the housing allowance work and to be tax advantaged for us, the government came up with this kind of a dual tax status. So what they said was, well, for all intents and purposes, for income tax purposes, for federal and state, you are considered an employee. And what that means is that your earnings are reported on a Form W-2, not a 1099. So you are an employee and you will pay federal and state income tax on your earnings. What's different is that they also said for Social Security and Medicare purposes, you are considered and self-employed, which means that you're going to pay the employee portion of Social Security. Okay, that's the 7.65%, and that's normal. Any job you have, you pay that percent. So there's nothing different about that. The part that's different is that you are also going to pay the employee portion. So your Social Security, your SECA tax jumps to 15.3% because you're paying both pieces of that. So let's see what this tax break looks like, and let's see how we compute it. So what it actually is that it will allow you to exclude some or all of the income that you earned being a priest or a deacon or a bishop, okay? You can exclude that from income taxes. So that means you don't have to pay federal income tax on it, and you don't have to pay state income tax on it if you live in California. But it doesn't exclude the SECA portion. That's the Medicare portion of it, the Social Security portion of it. But there are some rules and some limitations, and we're going to go over those. First of all, let's look and see who qualifies for a housing allowance. So in the Episcopal Church, people who qualify for the housing allowance are people who are employed as a bishop, priest, or deacon. So you have to be duly ordained, and this is income that you earn while you're performing your services as a cleric. The person who designates the housing allowance is the actual cleric, him or herself. So what you do is you compute the amount that you want to have as your housing allowance, the amount that will be excluded from federal and state income tax, and you will give that amount to the vestry or the bishop's committee at the end of the year. So you're going to give it to them for a resolution in December for the following year. So right now in December of 2020, we're putting together our housing allowance resolutions, and those will be in effect for the year 2021. The vestry or the bishop's committee is not responsible for the numbers. The exclusion numbers are the responsibility of the priest or deacon or bishop. The vestry or bishop's committee responsibility is to pass the resolution on a timely manner. So who is going to be the one who reports this housing allowance to the IRS? Well, the group that does that is the church. That housing allowance will appear on your W-2 if you rent or own your home. And we're going to go over that in a minute. But that's how it gets reported to the IRS. If you live in a rectory, the amount, the fair market value of the house is going to be reported by you in a collaboration with your tax preparer. But the actual housing allowance itself is reported on your W-2. And lastly, are survivors eligible for the exclusion? So in other words, if the priest dies sometime in the year, can the surviving spouse continue with the housing allowance exclusion? And the answer is no. So this is something that's available only for the clergy during their lifetime. One of the things that's becoming more and more common are priests who are bivocational ministers. So in other words, you work part-time at your job as a priest, and then you have maybe a corporate job. So if you are one of these bivocational ministers, it's really important to remember that the housing allowance can only be used for the earnings that you have from your work as a cleric. So only your ministerial earnings. You can't use any of your secular earnings toward your housing allowance. So let's look at what this looks like when it's reported on your W-2. And this is really important. We'll be getting our W-2s in another month or so, and you're going to need to look at it and make sure that it's done properly. So in this example, this clergy person earned $50,000, okay? $20,000 was declared as a housing allowance. And so that amount appears in box 14 of the Form W-2. The amount that's designated as cash salary appears on box 1 under wages, tips, and other compensation. So your wages will go in box 1, the amount of your housing allowance in box 14, and the total of those two numbers is your total salary package. Now, really importantly, note that box 4 and 6, Social Security tax withheld and Medicare tax withheld, are blank. This is really important. These are blank because you are not an employee for Social Security purposes. If you get your W-2 and there are amounts in these two boxes, box 4 and box 6, you need to take that W-2 back to your church and ask for an amended W-2 form. When you get an amended W-2 form, a couple important things will happen. One, those will go to zero. They will write you a check for the amount that was included in that because they have withheld that from your earnings and you can't use it that way. You have to pay your Social Security separately. And really importantly, if you have amounts in those two boxes, it is entirely possible for the IRS to say you are now an employee and they will disallow your housing allowance. And that would be a very bad tax ramification. So really importantly, your W-2 will have an amount in box 1 for wages, box 14 will be your housing allowance, and box 4 and 6 will be blank. So let's look and see now how you can compute your housing allowance, what the limitations are. So when you get ready to compute your housing allowance, it's a 3-pronged test. You have to take the lower of these 3 items to declare on your resolution. So it's the lower of the actual amount that you spend, or the amount that was designated as housing allowance by the vestry or bishop's committee, or the fair rental value of your house furnished with utilities. So let's break that down just a little bit. the amount that you actually spend on qualified expenses is pretty basic. And we're going to go over the things that are allowed for a housing allowance. So it's the lower of what you're actually spending, or it is the lower of the amount that you had on your actual resolution. Now, oftentimes what happens is you've got a housing allowance resolution, but then you end up spending more money. You have to take the lower of these three. It's also very likely that the fair rental value of your home will be less than what you actually spend. So for example, it's December of 2020 and you were saying, my kitchen's pretty old. I think it's time for remodel. Now, the money that you spend on that kitchen remodel qualifies as housing. You can put that amount in your housing allowance resolution, but the place that you may get limited is the value, the amount that you spend on that kitchen remodel may push your actual amount over what it would cost you to rent the place. And we can go over more examples of this later, but it's really important. It's the lower of these three things. Let's look and see what qualifies for housing. So your mortgage payment or your rent, real estate taxes, insurance that you spend on your home or your rental, furnishings and appliances. Okay, you buy a new kitchen table, that can qualify. You buy a new dishwasher, that can qualify. Structural repairs and remodeling, again, you decide I got to remodel my kitchen, those expenses qualify. Yard maintenance and improvements, you put in a new flower garden, plant some new trees, those count. Household maintenance items. Some people declare things like cleaning products and paper towels. Homeowners association dues and your utilities. So your cable, your electricity, gas, water, sewer, internet, trash collection. Now, interestingly enough, there is no definitive list of qualifying expenses available from the IRS. These are things that have passed audit. So we know that these things should be able to pass audit, that these are qualified expenses. They did, however, provide us with a list of items that don't qualify. If you have someone cleaning the inside of your house, that will not qualify. If you, well, any groceries or food, or even for entertaining, even if you have the vestry over, those do not qualify as housing expense. And any reimbursable business expenses will not qualify for housing allowance. So what might that be? Well, maybe your church says, hey, you work at home a lot, we're going to reimburse your internet. This is just an example. We're going to reimburse your internet. If they reimburse your internet, then that won't qualify, okay? If you have, well, that wouldn't be a business expense. All right, so let's look and see about this three-pronged test. Let's see how to determine the fair rental value of your home. So there's a couple ways. And actually, this is the hardest of all three of the tests, because you know how much you're spending, you know how much is in your housing allowance. So this is the one that's a little bit more difficult to substantiate, but it's not hard. So you can either have a realtor come and give you a written estimate of what the fair market rental of the house furnished would be with utilities, and they could put it on their letterhead. You can put that in your tax file. You can, on your own, go and look online. Try to see if you can find a similar home and how much it would cost. You can, and if it's not furnished, you could actually go to a furniture rental company on the internet and plug in some of the types of furnitures you have, like, you know, kitchen table with 4 chairs, a sofa, a coffee table, etc., and add that into it, plus utilities. Or what they say is any other reasonable method. Make sure that you're adding your utilities to your fair market value of your home furnished. So it's the whole package. the house furnished plus utilities. So that's the one prong that's the most challenging to get to, but it's super important because it's the lower of the three. All right, so many of people are living in a rectory. So in other words, the church is providing the housing for you. All right, so say like the church is providing your house, and it's believed that the fair market value of this house is $1,000 a month. This is the amount that's going to be excluded from your income tax, federal and California income tax. This amount will not appear on your W-2, and this amount is not part of what you will include in a housing allowance resolution if you have one. This amount, however, will be necessary when you are computing your taxes because you have to pay the SECA on it. You have to pay the Social Security tax on it. So for example, you go to work for a church and they say your salary is $60,000 a year, plus you will be living in this rectory. The rectory is determined to have a fair market value furnished with utilities of $1,000 a month. Your W-2 form will show $60,000 of salary. You will take $12,000, that number, to your tax preparer and say, this is the fair market value of the house that I've been provided. You will pay income tax on your salary, the $60,000, and you will pay SECA on the cash salary of $60,000 plus the housing of $12,000. And we are going to have an example on another screenshot of this particular computation. If you're living in a rectory and the church is providing you this house, it is possible that you will have additional expenses that would be considered housing allowance expenses that you can declare in a resolution. So for example, you're living in a house provided by the church, but the church does not provide a gardener, and you're paying a gardener. You can take the cost of that gardener and you can make a housing allowance resolution for those expenses. Remember that you're still going to be limited by that three-pronged test. It's going to be the lower of what you spend versus the lower of the housing resolution versus the lower of the fair market rental value of your home furnished with utilities. If you live in a home that you own, it's very similar. You're going to use for your housing allowance the cost of maintaining this home with that list from the other slide. You know, your mortgage, interest, property taxes, homeowners association dues, etc., utilities, versus the fair market rental value of your home furnished with utilities versus what the actual housing resolution is. So it's the same thing that's running through the whole thing. It's a three-pronged test. It's the lower of those three things, and it just depends upon if you're living in a rental, if you're living in something you own, or you're living in a rental, a rectory. If you're renting, the rent that you pay is basically taking the place of your mortgage payment. So it's going to be the lower of the rent that you're paying with utilities versus the housing allowance that you've designated at the end of each year for the following year versus the amount that is the fair market rental of this house furnished with utilities. We'll have some examples in a minute. So when do we designate the housing allowance? Okay, the housing allowance needs to be done before the beginning of the calendar year. So December is a really good month to process your housing allowance. Remember that these housing allowances are prospective. You cannot do them retroactively. So for example, if you forgot and you didn't pass your housing allowance until March, the housing expenses for January and February cannot be included in your housing allowance. It only goes forward. You can't go backwards. Now, you can do a mid-year adjustment So you say, well, gosh, my utilities have really gone up. I should have had a higher housing allowance. You can adjust it mid-year, but just remember that that adjustment goes only forward, not backwards. It's not retroactive. So your housing allowance has to be renewed every year. It has to be passed each year. There is some safety language, however, that helps you if, for example, you didn't have a quorum at your December meeting and you passed it in January. If you have this safety net language, which is in blue, at the end of your resolution that states for this and all future years unless otherwise provided, that will give you some breathing room. That will help you fill that gap. So put that at the end of your housing resolution. Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say that the clergy earns $60,000. That's the whole package, your whole compensation package. And the fair market value of your housing is $40,000. And the priest spends $40,000 on qualified housing during the year. And his or her housing allowance passed through the vestry or bishop's committee is $40,000. So we can see in this example, this is a pretty clean example because the fair market value of the housing allowance and the amount that is spent is all the same. It's all 40. So 20 will be designated as cash salary and 40 as housing, which means that you will pay income tax on 20, which is the salary, and you will pay SECA, the Social Security piece, on the whole thing, on all $60,000. So this is a pretty easy example. Let's look and see what happens if your costs, the amount that you actually incur, you actually spend, are greater than the fair market value. So this priest earns $60,000, same as before. The fair market value of the housing is $40,000, same as before. Housing allowance resolution, $40,000, same as before, but you spend $50,000, okay? You know, you did some improvements to the house. You are limited to the lesser on that three-pronged test, the lesser of the fair market value, the amount that you spend, or the housing allowance resolution. So in this case, we can't claim 50. We have to claim $40,000 because it's the less of those three amounts. So the salary is still 20, your housing is 40, you'll pay income tax on just the salary portion on the 20, and you will pay the SECA or Social Security portion on the whole thing, the entire $60,000. Now, here's a limitation that's important to note. And if you have questions on this, please ask them. But we have a wonderful, another very wonderful tax advantaged program, and that's the 403B. And what that allows us to do is to save for retirement in a tax deferred way. But if you participate in this program, you have to remember that this creates a limitation, or it can create a limitation when you are computing your housing allowance. So same example, priest earns $60,000. The fair market value of the housing is $40,000. But this person is putting $24,000 into a 403B, which means that we can't take more than $36,000 on a housing allowance. So in other words, the housing allowance, you can't double. The housing allowance and the 403B can't be the same dollars. They can't overlap. So if you have designated the 24 and put that in a 403B, then you have to take the $60,000 total, subtract out your 403B, and the remainder can be your housing. The thing that helps you with this, the 403B, is that the amount that goes into your 403B is never never taxed for SECA. You never pay Social Security on it, and the tax is deferred. So your current income tax would be 0 because you've got part designated as 403B, and part designated as housing, and you will only pay SECA on the housing portion of it. That's a little bit more complicated of an example. And if you're not familiar with the 403B and you're interested in learning more, let me know, and I'm happy to walk you through that. Now, sometimes the housing, especially in places like Los Angeles, is very expensive, and sometimes people are working part-time. So say like in this example, the clergy earns $24,000. So a much reduced salary, probably part-time cleric. The fair market value of your housing is $40,000. You spend $50,000 on it. Your housing allowance is going to be limited to the amount that you earn, right? So you earn $24,000, fair market value 40, you spend 50, your housing allowance is going to be 24,000, and you would pay income tax on 0 and the SECA or the Medicare Social Security on 24,000. What happens when you retire? This is really wonderful. So when you retire, your entire CPG retirement check is designated by the Board of CPG to be a housing allowance. So when you retire, you don't have a vestry to go to or Bishop's Committee anymore. So CPG does this for you. But they will actually designate the whole thing as housing allowance, which means that you will not have to pay the federal or state income tax on it if you're living in California. But you're still limited. You still have to do the tests. You still have to take the lower of your actual expenses or the fair market value. One of the blessings of being retired and receiving a retirement check is that you will no longer have to pay the SECA or Medicare, Social Security tax on it. So it's entirely possible that when you're retired, you will get a CPG retirement check, and you won't have to pay any tax on it at all. So something to keep in mind. So what if you designate your housing allowance and you realize that you've overshot it? You've designated too much. You weren't able to spend the whole amount on housing. It's an easy fix. At the end of the year, you take the amount that you spent, you take your other limitations, and you take this to your tax preparer and you just make an adjustment on your tax return. So if you find out that you have overshot it, declared too much, it's an easy fix at the end of the year. What if you want to change your housing allowance during the year? Again, this is easy. You can change it prospectively at any point in time during the year. You just submit a new resolution to your vestry or your bishop's committee, and when it's effective, you'll start your housing allowance with your new amount going forward. What if you move? Well, if you move, you probably have a different expenses, a new fair market value, etc. Again, you just make a new housing resolution, take it to your vestry or bishop's committee, and that will become effective on that date, and you move forward with your new resolution. What if you retire? The housing allowance that you declare with your church or vestry and up until the date of retirement is the one that you use for that portion of the year. When you start drawing your retirement check, the whole check will be designated as housing allowance. We kind of talked a little bit about, like, what if I remodeled my kitchen or I did some big home improvement? While these costs qualify as housing allowance expenditures, just be careful that you're applying that 3-pronged test. It's easy to redo your housing allowance. That's super easy. So the expenses, the amount that you're actually spending, and your new housing resolution will be just fine. Your limitation may be with the fair market rental value of your home. So you have to look at all 3 of those different limitations. And what if you're doing all of this and you go, okay, my head is just going to explode. This is so complicated and I just need some help. Well, there are some resources. You can always call or email me. I'm very happy to walk you through your resolution. I'm very happy to answer your questions. And then another resource to keep in mind, probably not for housing resolution, but if at the end of the year you have questions about your housing allowance and how to report it on your income tax return, or how to do the reconciliation if you have spent too much, there is a free help for you through the CPG. There's a tax hotline, and these two people are there to answer your questions. And Dolly Rios also speaks Spanish. So those are resources for you. So this is the end of the slide portion of the show. And I am most pleased to answer your questions. And I know, Neil, I saw your hand coming up, but I can't do two things at once. So I'm very happy to answer questions.
Yes, just a thing to note. I have found that if you're using TurboTax and you do your own taxes, when you put in housing allowance, but then it says how much of that housing allowance did you actually use. So, for example, if you don't come up to what the designated housing allowance is, TurboTax will calculate that for you.
Okay,
so
good.
If you've only used 45 of $60,000 housing allowance, that will take it into account. So it's almost better to overshoot if the overshoot is quote unquote what you think the actual lowest will be, because if you then to undershoot.
You're absolutely right. And I personally overshoot mine every year for that very reason. My crystal ball doesn't always work really well, and I can always reconcile it when I file my taxes, but I can't ever get that money back, and I don't want to leave those dollars on the table.
The other question I have is I'm kind of in an odd situation this year, and it is that we sold our townhouse in Monrovia, and so with the sale of the townhouse, we now, our quote unquote permanent residence is our home here in Palm Springs. And a couple days a week, I'm in Monrovia. I am, using a small apartment room, but it's not my main home. So the question is, do I just see my real home here in Palm Springs, where I have all my expenses, and use that as my basis for housing allowance, or and just forget about the other apartment?
Yeah, and this is not uncommon. And so the IRS regulations state that it needs to be your principal residence, right? So what you'll need to do is build your best case, saying that, look, I'm in Monrovia 1-2 nights a week, and I am in Palm Springs, my principal residence, it's 5-6 nights a week. Therefore, Palm Springs is my principal residence. Right. So just make sure that you document that very, very well. Right. But again, it's principal residence, and not unusual at all. And I mean, millions of different examples of why that would happen. But just the most important thing you can do is to document. You cannot over document.
Right. Well, and then documenting would be, I have all of our tax records. I have all of our expenses, everything that I put into TurboTax or into Quicken or whatever. That should document that this is the primary, because I'm not spending money on the other,
Right. And of course, it's time spent there. Right. Because what you don't want to have happen in audit is they go, well, you just picked the most expensive place, and this one's really closer to the Monrovia house's apartment is really closer to where you're working. So that's the kind of issues that would come up in an audit. So that's where you need to be very, very careful. And the amount of time that you're spending in Palm Springs versus Monrovia is key.
Okay. Well, that's easy to do with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you on that.
You bet. I know Roberto has questions.
Ada, would you be able to ask Padre Roberto's questions for us so that the
¿Está
folks watching the
tu
live
chat?
stream can also see his question?
Sí, cuando mi esposa y yo hicimos nuestros taxes de este año, nos dijeron que por una nueva ley que entró, solamente teníamos un crédito de $12,000 cada uno, o sea, 24,000 en total, y que pues nos convenía esta ley y entonces ya no pudimos meter nosotros nuestra lista de gastos de deducibles que teníamos preparada porque estaba este crédito de $12,000 de cada uno. ¿Qué hay al respecto de esta ley?
Okay, so with this new tax law, what happened was that $12,000 plus dollars, which is $24,000 for a married couple, took the place of your itemized deductions. So for many people, that meant that that $24,000 deduction is more valuable than actual expenses because the actual expenses are lower than the $24,000. So, and Roberto, I don't know if you, I think you might be in a rectory, but if you owned your home, it could be that all of the interest expense, it didn't matter because it was less than $24,000 and your deduction was $24,000. But your housing allowance is still important because the housing allowance is excluded from federal and state income tax. So two different concepts. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Okay, great. If anybody has any further questions, please put them in the chat. In the meantime, Reverend Michele, I wanted to ask you, in your experience, what do you find is the most common misunderstanding that people have?
I think that some people don't realize that you need to make that housing allowance every year, and it needs to be made before the beginning of the year. That you can't have a housing allowance that is retroactive. It's only prospective. So I think that's the biggest misunderstanding.
Okay. And what would you recommend to folks that they do during the year in order to make the process easier when it comes time to pass that resolution in December?
So we actually have worksheets available at the diocesan level, and also CPG has worksheets, and they also have a little tutorial on preparing housing allowance. So if you use those worksheets, you can actually document the expenses that you have during the year. And then at the end of the year, when you want to project your expenses for the following year, you have all the records right there.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. Is there anything else that you would like to mention before we wrap up?
So I know that this is really technical, and it's a lot to get kind of like a blast. But I'm available to help you. I'm available to answer your questions. I am a phone call away. So please take advantage of that. I love doing that kind of stuff. And I hope you found this helpful. I hope that it wasn't too crazy.
All right. Thank you very much, Reverend Michele. As a reminder, the recording of today's session is posted on the Diocesan Facebook page and YouTube channel. The next workshop in our series will be Wednesday, January 6th at 7 p.m. on the topic of social media strategies for congregations, hosted by Marisol Barrios and Rose Hayden Smith of the Diocesan Program Group on Communications. For more information and the link to register, please visit www.diocesanconvention.com. On the Diocesan Convention website also will be information about this workshop with the resources presented today. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Bye. Thank you.